right, fantastic. What an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for inviting me to be with you today. I want to echo what Tom said. This is an extraordinarily exciting time for you, but can I share with you something about my roots that makes this especially meaningful? I grew up, and I'm not making this up, it just occurred to me as I was listening to Lawrence and to Tom to make this connection. I actually grew up on an island in the Mediterranean that had no electricity, none. We had one house on that island that had a generator, and that was like the person, right, that we all aspired to be someday, to be that person who had electricity on demand in his home. We would get water out of a well every day. Ice would be delivered to us with a donkey. And now here we are, right? Here I am, here we are, where we don't think twice about where the electricity comes from. It is a God-given right that we have it. Right? So let me ask you a question, because I think fundamentally what I'm describing, what I've been through, what we've all been through, the last 60 years of my life, however long you've been here to share the journey, is not a technological journey. And this sounds like heresy that I would say that. It's not a technological journey. And allow me to punctuate that at the very beginning by asking you to do something for me. Grab your smartphones. You all have one. Does anyone not have a smartphone on them today? Of course not, right? How could you be part of a civilized world and not have a smartphone? Is that possible? So you have your smartphone. Answer this question honestly, and we'll shut off the cameras now so no one will hear this outside of this room, right? How many of you woke up this morning and before you got out of bed, checked this device for email, for text messages, for any sort of notifications that were critical, because the world cannot survive if you don't check these before you get out of bed this morning? How many of you? Show of hands. Come on, be honest. Look at that. Right? I mean, you're an important group of people. You have nothing better to do with the first few minutes of your morning than check your smartphone. So you see that? So let me submit to you, and I only submit these ideas. These are not ideas which I ask you to adopt. I simply submit them for your consideration. But let me submit to you that what we've experienced is not technological change. What we're experiencing and will continue to experience at an ever accelerating rate is behavioral change. So when you talk about putting the customer at the center, this is not about technology at the center. It is about understanding and respecting, which I love, by the way, because on your list of, there are a few things I'll refer to here, of important attributes. Respect the customer is one of them, right? Behavior is something which we acknowledge and we respect, and then we accommodate. And the more empathetic we are to that behavior, the more loyal we are as brands. Right? It's not about someone being loyal to you, it's about you being loyal as a brand. And part of what I want to focus my comments on today is how you achieve an organization that has that empathy towards the behavioral sentiment of your customers at the level of the individual. Because at the end of the day, do you sell product? You're not product. You don't own the product in many cases, right? Right? What you sell is a service, and that service needs to conform and align with my values, my beliefs, and that's why I buy anything from anyone, including the power that I buy. So a lot to think about there. We'll dive deep. I should share with you that my background is actually engineering. I began wanting to be an electrical engineer. That didn't quite pan out very well. But I then went on to civil engineering, because Tom was talking about the infrastructure, the bridges and the highways. I wanted to build those bridges. I wanted to build big bridges. My dad was a computer engineer. I'll share with you a bit about him because he had an interesting background which relates to this. And he would build the componentry of early computers and bring these home so that I could play with them as a child. My first memories are of taking apart disk drives, early disk drives that were being prototyped to store data. And my father would explain to me how these things worked. And at the age of 6 or 7 years old, I knew how a disk drive worked. I was so popular at school, you can't imagine the popularity that this gave me. There was, in fact, and I remember this moment, there was, in fact, a time when he brought home the first portable disk drive. It was called a Winchester disk drive. Anyone have any idea what a Winchester disk drive is? A few of you are nodding your heads, right? It was the first portable drive because it was about 80 pounds. You could put it in your trunk and drive off with it, ergo it was portable. And he showed me how this worked and how the drive operated. And his idea of a weekend father and son day was not going to the ball game, but going to Radio Shack, the electronics store, to test the vacuum tubes on the vacuum tube tester, right? It was a pretty shitty childhood, let me tell you, obviously. But it prepared me for the technology, but also prepared me to understand, I think at a very deep level, the degree of behavioral change that we've had to go through. I'll tell you a bit about the books a little bit later, but let me dive in here. I want to ask you to do something with me, go through an exercise here to sort of prepare you for the commentary, and I'll share with you a lot of numbers. There's a lot of data here which I want to throw at you, and I'm a little reluctant to throw so much of it at you so quickly, but I do think this is data that you need to understand about demographics and population growth and what that will mean, about the increase in utilization of transportation and vehicles and what that will mean. We did a large study for IBM that took over a year to do, and we actually projected the trajectory over the next almost 50 years of transportation, commercial and consumer transportation globally. And I'll show you some numbers there that I think are fascinating and totally non-intuitive. Totally non-intuitive. When I first saw these numbers, it hit me over the head like a brick, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'll share that with you. So a lot of data to come, but to prepare you for that, and as I look at the demographic, most of you, I think can do this as I ask you to. I want you to put yourself back in time. I want you to go back to the 1960s. How many of you can go back to the 1960s and have memories of the 60s? Right? A few of you do. There's a few young ones in here. So for those that weren't here in the 60s, I'll tell you what we were thinking about in the 1960s. It was a tremendous era of change, very disruptive era, certainly.
We choose to go to the moon.
Kennedy, very appropriate for this venue, changed the way we thought about our ambitions. He sent us to the moon. It was a great change in social structures. Music had a lot to do with this. It was before the Beatles. 1960 was before the Beatles were the Beatles. There was some Quarry Men back then. But other things were happening in the 1960s which were very relevant. So I was born in 1958. And I see that as being significant because I think I was born at the same time the first computers were born. This is an ENIAC. 80,000 vacuum tubes in this device, right? No transistors back then, vacuum tubes that powered this thing. And what's amazing about these early computers was that at the time, we really did not know how they would be used. We had no idea what the future of computing looked like because we hadn't built the use cases yet for computing, right? Anyone know what this is? I want to give you a sense for how tremendous the change has been. What is this? This thing, they're loading it into the belly of a Pan Am. Take a guess. What do you think it is? Anyone? It's not a copier. No, that's close. It kind of looks like a copier, perhaps. No. It is one of the earliest, the IBM 350. It's a disk drive that IBM was selling in the very early 1960s. And this would hold an amazing, take a guess, how much do you think it would hold? And it's not gigabytes, I'll tell you that much. It's not gigabytes. 3.5 megabytes of storage. It weighed 2 tons, and it stored 3.5 megabytes of storage. Isn't that incredible to think about? I'll give you some more numbers here in a minute, but you could rent this, by the way, for about $3,000 a month. You could rent this device. No one would want to buy one, because what in the world would you do with 3.5 megabytes of storage? I mean, that's inconceivable that you would have that much data, right? My wristwatch probably has 10 times that much data on it right now. That IBM 350, keep that in the back of your head, 2 tons, 3.5 megabytes of data. What's happened since that point in time? So let me share with you that when we think about those things that have most altered the landscape of civilization, of the economy, of the way we live, we work, we play, it usually falls into these few buckets, right? It's been the miniaturization, the digitalization, the mobilization of technology, and we can apply that to energy, we can apply that to transportation. Let's take a step even further back, and let's just see how prolific that evolution has been. So let's lay the foundation for what I see as being ultimately the infrastructure through which power demand ultimately is defined. Right, so hold that thought. This is the infrastructure through which power demand ultimately is defined. So in many ways, when we look at economics, what we look at are deterministic variables. What are the variables that cause everything else to follow suit? And I think in many ways, the advent of the IoT, as we talk about in the industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT, these are surrogates, they're indicators that tell us what's to follow. So they're leading indicators, not just the economy and the technology, but also behavioral leading indicators. So let's go back to 1960. When we had, a few dozen, let's be generous and say we had a few hundred computer users total in the world, which is a generous number. It doesn't matter if you start with 1,000. The math still is incredible here as you follow this trajectory. If I were to look at 1960 to the present day and plot a line. That top line is the total number of computing devices that are available worldwide as measured by the total number of computing users, okay? So it's not necessarily devices, it's a bit higher factor, a bit higher multiple in terms of computing users, but roughly either devices or users, the numbers are very close as you follow this trajectory. From 1960 to the present day, we've gone from, let's say, 1,000 computer users in 1960 to today. How many devices do we have globally? Computing devices, not sensors. Leave the sensors out of this. Computing devices, what's the number? Anyone? You can kind of see it from here, but what's the number? 10 billion. 10 billion. 10 billion total computing devices. Many more computer users than that, but let's equate computing devices to users. We're being generous here to make the math as conservative as possible. So what's the formula? What's the arithmetic formula by which the number of computing devices has increased every decade? What's the very simple arithmetic formula? How would you describe this to a 5-year-old? Just add a 0. Order of magnitude every decade, right? Increase by 1 order of magnitude every decade. And this has been very consistent. And by the way, this is not only going to continue on the trajectory that you see here, it's actually going to increase by a factor of about let's say, at least 1.2 times what the historical factor has been. That could increase much more rapidly. I'll talk later about quantum computing and what that might do to this. But let's stay on the linear trajectory that we've got here. By 2100, if we follow this, how many user computing devices will there be globally? If we follow that trajectory, what's the number? Stat is 0 for every decade, right? You're going to add a little bit more than a 0, because again, it's like 1.2. It's not just a factor of 1 order of magnitude. We will have 10 to the 21st user computing devices. How big of a number is that? It is 100 times as many grains of sand as there are on all the world's beaches. So stop right now, right? Let's freeze the conversation. Remember I said to you that in 1960, while my father was building the early computers and while I was, playing with vacuum tubes and what have you, there were about 1,000 user computing devices total, 1,000 computing users. If I had taken any one of those 1,000 users back then and said to them that we'd be at 10 billion devices today, what would they have said to me? What would you have said to me in 1960? Let's assume we were in this building in 1960 and I was saying to you, 1960, that by the year 2020, there will be 10 billion ENIACs in the world. What would you have said to me back then? No way. And that would have been a very kind thing to say to me, right? Others would not have been so kind, right? That's absurd. That's ridiculous. How could you possibly justify 10 billion of these? Think of the natural resources that you'd be using. Think of the power consumption. We couldn't afford a planet with 10 billion ENIACs. And you know what? You would have been right, because we don't have 10 billion ENIACs. What we have are 7 billion of these devices, which were inconceivable back then. So when I say to you today that by 2100, there will be 100 times as many computers as there are grains of sand on all the world's beaches, the same thought occurs to you. How is that possible? Because this is not the use case for 2100. It's not the use case for 2050, by the way. So what I'm going to show you is that we are exiting, and this is so difficult to do, and I love the analogy of Edison versus where we are today and how this is as disruptive a time to think about the future as it was when Edison first came up with the first light bulb and the notion that we would all use electricity. It is as disruptive because to think about these numbers right now, we don't have use cases by which to validate them or justify them. But here's why. We are in the final stages of exiting the industrial era. And we are entering an era not of scarcity, but an era of abundance. And what will fuel and power that abundance is what you are building as an infrastructure here. So allow me to make that case with you, because it sounds as though I'm pandering. I am not. These were all slides. This was all research I did well before Lawrence ever said to me, come join us. Long before I had written the book, Revealing the Invisible. And long before I had written the chapter of the book, which my publisher did not allow me to publish because they were too far down the path with this book. And I published this book anyway just to say, you know what, I have to tell you, there's more to artificial intelligence than what I've written in the book. So you're going to get the full story here. And it was not written for you. And that's critical, because I don't want you to think this is patronizing. It is not. I have a firm belief that what you're doing is absolutely critical and essential to the economic, social welfare of society going forward. So let me see if I can make that case. So here we are today. That chip, by the way, was one terabyte on my finger. So we've taken that IBM 350 and we've reduced the size of it by about 1 million-fold, and we increased the capacity of it by about 300,000-fold. Right? That one chip will carry 300,000 times as much data as that IBM 350 would. Inconceivable, is it not? Because when we think in terms of scarcity, we think of physical resources and multiplying the physicality to increase productivity. That's not what we're doing anymore. We don't have to increase and amplify the physicality. In fact, what we're doing is using less and less natural resource to achieve and to power a greater and greater value in society. That's just one side of the coin. The other side is the data side, which is what this was the forgotten chapter. When I finished the book, I thought to myself, this is all wonderful, but something is missing. How are we going to fuel AI? And the answer is we're going to fuel it through data, an abundance of data well beyond anything we can imagine. So just to be somewhat provocative here, Lawrence told you I'd occasionally poke at a nerve ending. This is one of those nerve endings. You don't want to believe this when you see it. The numbers are what the numbers are. The math does what the math does. I'm not contriving this. If we project 40%, 70%, and 100% compounded annual growth rate of data going forward, and this, by the way, I promise I will blow your mind the next 2 or 3 slides. This, by the way, is an extraordinarily conservative estimate. By the year 2220, we will have exceeded the storage capacity of the Earth as measured in number of atoms to store that number of bits. We won't have enough atoms in the Earth to store the number of bits that we will have in data storage. Today, data centers globally today, are using the same amount of energy as the entire aviation industry. Within about 10 to 15 years, data centers in Japan alone will exceed, their power consumption will exceed the entirety of Japan's power consumption. So these are very difficult numbers to appreciate and to embrace, but this is the trajectory that we are on. We can imagine a tsunami coming at you. We can look at it and we can curse it, and we can say it's not real, it's an illusion, but that tsunami will hit. And we know this is happening. The math, if anything, as I said, is being conservative. And we'll exceed the bounds of the known universe in terms of the amount of data that we want as well if we start to ramp up to 100% increase year over year. So we hear in the context of this how AI is helping us to solve these problems as we move to more complex problems that require more data. Be very careful of this, because while AI can be proven, in a microcosm, we can demonstrate fully capable AI. It is not yet scalable. This is a very important point to make and to understand. We do not yet have the infrastructure with which to scale AI. So before I go to this, quick example. An autonomous vehicle generates in a single day between 2 and 20 terabytes of data in a single day. A fully autonomous vehicle, level 4 or level 5 autonomous vehicle. 2 to 20 terabytes a day. That's 7.3 petabytes a year. Today, to store 7.3 petabytes in the cloud would cost you at least $300,000 and more like about $500,000. So the data for that Tesla costs 10 times as much, at least as much as the Tesla itself costs. You can't scale that. So you can demonstrate one self-driving car, one fully autonomous vehicle, but it doesn't mean that you can scale that. We don't have the infrastructure yet with which to do this. And part of it is because we can't power this infrastructure yet. We don't have the mechanism by which to do it. I mean, these are hard stops. So all the promise of AI hinges on our ability to build an infrastructure that will power that kind of a future. And we are so far from that right now. To give you a sense for how, the complexity of what AI does, by the way. So if we were to think of AI as being a solution to problems that are too complex to solve with linear computing. One way to think of it is that if I were to take board games like tic-tac-toe, checkers, chess, and the game of Go, and I were to plot the total number of possible games that you could play based on the number of legal moves that you could make in that game, you can see the numbers going up here rather steeply. By the time we get to Go, we're at 10 to the 800th, which is a number that for all intents and purposes is infinity. If I were to draw, this is a logarithmic scale, if I were to draw this scale on a linear chart, this bar, the actual bar itself would exceed the bounds of the visible universe, right? That's how big the bar would be. Right? So we are starting to tackle problems that have no precedent in the prior application of classical computing. What does that mean? So let's go beyond the bounds of the visible universe here for just a second and think about a very simple problem that today is unsolvable with classical computing. Let's say that I wanted to model a molecule. Anyone want to guess what molecule this is, by the way? This is a very appropriate molecule for first thing in the morning. Anyone? It's not it's caffeine. Yeah, very close. It's caffeine. This is the caffeine molecule. If you were to model every state of a caffeine molecule down to its quantum level, you would need 10 to the 48th bits of information. There are 10 to the 50th atoms that make up the world. Okay. These problems are extraordinarily difficult to solve. So when we make the move to AI, when we make the move to autonomous devices, when we make the move to true IoT, intelligent IoT, when we make the move to quantum computing, these are the kinds of problems that we're going to be solving. And you say, well, why do I want to model a coffee molecule? Why would you want to model the human brain? Why would you want to model a certain part of my anatomy to then map the pharmaceutical that's going to treat that condition? We could solve, problems like cancer can be solved with this kind of computing, but you can't scale it. You cannot scale it. To take 5 qubits, which are the basic a mechanism by which quantum computers work, take 5 qubits or 16 qubits and get to the point where you can supercool them enough to give you some sort of an output, you have to build a machine that literally is about 5 times the size of me, just to supercool that very tiny chip, right? So while this is a fascinating point in time, and think about it, we can prove that it works individually, right? Edison could turn the damn light bulb on. It works. We have light. Well, no, we don't. We have a light bulb, or maybe we have a dozen light bulbs or 100 light bulbs, but we don't have electrification. This is where we are today, right? We have the ability to solve some of the greatest challenges that face us, right? Diseases, economic issues, pandemics, global climate change. We can solve these issues, but we can't scale the solution. So we are at the precipice of what I think is going to go down in history, long history, as one of the most incredibly disruptive periods, but also one of the periods that opened up one of the greatest eras of innovation that mankind has ever known. I opened this book talking about the electric industry and electrification and how utilities defined not a model by which electricity was delivered to the globe, but by which innovation was delivered to the globe. And we don't hear about that, right? We talk about how wonderful the light bulb is. We talk about how wonderful it was to have utilities and to have the ability to plug your whatever device into the wall. But what we forget was that the innovation of the 20th century could not have happened without electrification and utilities. That was the contribution of electrification. It was to innovation. And that's where I see us today. We're at the same sort of precipice. So we're about to take that step into a very unknown and uncertain void as a result, but one that I think is going to have an incredible impact. So is data the new oil of that? No, data is not the new oil. Right? We hear this all the time. Data is a highly proprietary asset. Ask Uber if it will take its data and give it to Lyft. Of course not. Lyft won't give it to Uber. Will they trade gasoline? Sure. I don't care. Gasoline is gasoline. It's a commodity. So data is not the new oil. Data is ultimately the mechanism by which we actually differentiate ourselves and better serve our customers by understanding their behaviors. It is not the new oil. So when I think about the future, and I think about what this will look like, right? And I go to some of those numbers that we just talked about, I have to ask the question, ultimately, what is this? Is it an automobile? Is it a product? Is it a service? Is it a mechanism through which I deliver an experience? Most organizations that are looking at autonomous vehicles aren't looking at the product of a vehicle anymore. What they're looking at is how do I hyper-personalize the experience for the individual who's in that vehicle at that point in time. It's a platform for delivering experience. I would submit, again, that what you have is a platform, both in terms of the data that you acquire about usage, and in terms of the expectation of the consumer, you have a platform for delivering experiences. And the question I would pose to you ultimately is, what are you doing about that? What are you doing about that to deliver hyper-personalized experiences that understand it's not about the raw data, it is about how I use that data to ultimately deliver value that is scalable. And that's we're not quite there yet. I think we're within 20, 30 years of that, and I'll show you the numbers that I think will prove that point. But I would take the focus off the product. For the last 100 years, innovation has been about the product. Innovation today is about the experience. And experience is infinitely malleable. You can innovate without bounds when it comes to experience. With product, not so much. And when we think about that experience, the central player in that experience is an entity that we're just beginning to create and to understand. So if I think about all the ways that digital technology today is delivered, let's take commercial trucking as our example. There are all sorts of things that we do to provide, including driverless technology, provide a platform for that vehicle to deliver its service and its value. However, when you strip it all away, at the end of the day, what you're creating is a digital artifact, which I call the digital self. Every entity, moving forward, has this notion of a digital twin, a digital self. Every machine, every component, every device, every person, every pet, everything has a digital self. Why? Because by representing everything digitally, we now have the opportunity to create interactions between those digital entities that we could not in the real world. So in the analog world, we cannot connect behaviors. In the digital world, we can. And we can create experiences based on those behaviors that we otherwise would be impossible. We couldn't do it in the analog world. Everything comes back to how that data is used in a proprietary manner to better understand the customer and to then serve those experiences based on an alignment with that understanding. This is what Amazon is doing, right? In talking to Amazon, I'll give you some examples here, but one of the easiest ones to understand is Amazon. Amazon wants ultimately their end game for retail anyway, because their end game is to own the universe, of course, but for retail specifically, their end game is for you to show up at home one day, find a package on your doorstep and say, you know what, I didn't order anything from Amazon. That's very odd. Open up the package, look inside and say, oh my goodness, how did they know this is exactly what I needed tomorrow? Right? They want to use that ability to understand you, to predict the future. And you say, boy, that sounds creepy. You know what? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly 40, 50 years ago, it would have been awful creepy if I had told you that you'll have a device on your person which tracks you like endangered wildlife. Because that's what you have. I mean, Google and Facebook know where you are every minute of the day. And don't be deceived by thinking that you can, alter some settings on your phone and thereby evade that. You cannot. You cannot. Right? This device makes you completely vulnerable, entirely penetratable. Right? There's an Israeli organization. I teach a cyber course at Boston University. There's an Israeli corporation that we talk about and we use as a case study, which today can tap into any phone on the face of the planet without you doing a single thing to acknowledge. It's not a phishing email. They will tap into your phone, they will download your entire history, all your photos, your text messages, your emails, and you will never know it has been done. And they can do that with anyone on the face of the planet, all right? This makes you completely vulnerable and transparent. So I've got a question for you. Why do you use it? If it makes you that vulnerable, why do you use it? Because the value still outweighs the risk. That's what I asked you at the beginning. The value of having this makes you a productive inhabitant of this planet. It gives you opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have. It gives you a measure of safety that you wouldn't, for yourself, for your children, that you would otherwise not have. Right? So the value outweighs the risk. And none of this is without risk. All of it is with abundant risk, but the value exceeds the abundance of that risk. So what am I showing you here? So a few years back, a hurricane blew through Florida, a horrible hurricane blew through Florida, Hurricane Irma, devastated the state. But the hurricane, as most hurricanes are, had a perimeter inside of which that devastation was most manifest. If you could get out of that perimeter, you were safe. So what happened when the hurricane hit was that a few folks had a Tesla. I want to show you how the digital self creates innovation in real time. A few folks who had a Tesla called up Tesla and said, hey, you know what? I've got a Tesla. My battery, at that time, Tesla was throttling batteries through software. So if you had a 75 kilowatt battery, it could be throttled back to 65 kilowatts, and you would pay for the 65 kilowatt battery, just a software switch. You still have the same battery, same platform. So folks called up Tesla and said, hey, I've got your 65 kilowatt battery. Could you, unthrottle me? Give me 75 kilowatts, because if you do that, I can get out of the path of the hurricane. And Tesla said, sure. Simple solution. But what did Tesla then do? What did Tesla do? Real-time innovation, changing the platform in real time. What did they do? They did a quick inventory of all cars that were within that radius and said, let's unthrottle all of them for the next 4 or 5 days. Let them all get out, and we'll tell them that we're doing this, but they will just have another 15 minutes of drive time as a result, without asking the question through a focus group, right? No market research needed. We will innovate in the moment. This notion of autonomic innovation is essential. If you have the data, you don't have to ask the question. you can innovate autonomically. And there are companies, E2Open is one of the best ones that I've seen, that have what they call digital control towers that are analogous to sort of the control towers that manage airplane traffic. And what they will do is in a supply chain, any supply chain, it could be a supply chain that delivers energy, it could be a supply chain that delivers aviation parts. They did this for the 777. They can autonomically change the supply chain based on manufacturing requirements without a human being ever being present. They can innovate the supply chain autonomically. The same way that your nervous system tells you to breathe. In the 10, 15 minutes that I've been up here, I haven't thought once to myself, I should breathe now. Right? It doesn't occur to you because your autonomic nervous system does that for you. Same thing happening with supply chains when E2Open is involved with their control towers. So what we're seeing here is autonomic innovation that uses the data to modify the solution of the platform to achieve the purposes of the end user without the end user ever asking. Right? Purely predictive capability. It's the same thing Amazon wants to do with that package that shows up on your doorstep. And you know what? At the end of the day, why wouldn't we want this? Why wouldn't you want someone to predict what your actual needs are, not what your creepy needs are, right? Not stuff that is going to creep you out. Like, why am I seeing this from Amazon? I don't want this. Why is it showing me this? But to actually understand you. And think of the analogy here. Let's say that you had a personal shopper or a personal assistant. The more they know about you, the better they can serve you. Right, so my EA, Sharon, sent me a text this morning saying, I'm trying to book some stuff for you. You know what? I just realized I don't have the last 4 of your social. And in her text, she said, it's probably the one thing I don't know about you. I said, you're right. Now you know everything. Here's my last 4 of my social, right? The better she is at knowing who I am and me disclosing who I am, the better she can serve me. She doesn't have to worry about asking the question. Why not have autonomous devices that can do the same thing? So the direction we're going in is using data not as a commodity, not as the new oil, but using it as a way by which we can serve that digital self in ways that the self does not even need to first ask for that service, right? That predictive capability is central, I think, to where we're going with this notion of the digital twin, of the digital self. It's one of the central constructs, I believe, ultimately, that will differentiate companies as they move forward in terms of how they compete with each other and how they gain the customers, not the customer's loyalty, but how they gain a customer through being loyal to the customer. It's turning the tables, right? So the industrial era model was customer loyalty. I am loyal to a brand. I'm loyal to Colgate because that's what my mother used, right? I'm loyal to Ivory Soap because that's what was in the house when I was a kid. No. The brand is loyal to me because it understands me. It understands at this time of year, I get a little dry in the elbows. My knees start to itch a little bit from the dryness. And it delivers to me a product that understands that. I don't have to worry about asking for it. Right? So that notion of a loyal brand that respects me, doesn't creep me out, but respects me is absolutely essential. So coming back to this, what the hell is this? Is it a car? Is it a service? Is it an experience? And unlike most Boston-based academics, I'm going to answer this question for you. I'm just going to not just ask the question, I'm going to answer it for you. Because one of the areas where I think we've got the greatest visibility is in exactly what transportation will look like between now and the year 2050. And it's not going to look like anything that you currently imagine. Hold the thought. I'm going to come back to that. Hold that thought. So how and why do we become so blind to the future? We're intelligent people. Our organizations have plenty of resources, have a great deal of brain power, and yet we still end up finding ourselves blind to the future. We're always taken by surprise by the future. And I think it's a worthwhile question to ask, and part of it has to do with the fact that we adopt patterns of behavior that we bake into our organizations. Kodak, despite the popular narrative around this, Kodak did not go out of business because its executives were too stupid to understand digital photography. They understood it intimately. Right? They invented it in their labs. They understood what the threat was. The problem Kodak had, and if you talk to its executives, they will tell you it's not the mythology of we didn't get digital. It's that they had an industrial infrastructure they could not break free of. Their industrial supply chains, their plant, manufacturing equipment, all that was based on film. As a publicly held company, how do you disengage from that? And the answer is you can't. It's nearly impossible to disengage from it. The best you can hope for is to spin off something that will invest in that and ultimately create a vacuum that sucks you into it. Right? Kodak didn't do that. I think that's the error that they made was that, if anything. But if you think about this notion of getting stuck to these patterns of the past, I'm fascinated by the psychology of this, individually and organizationally.
Have you ever borrowed a book?
I'm going to bring you back. Bring that volume up just for a little bit for us, Eric or Colin, if you can. Does anyone remember these ads that AT&T ran? I'm not going to tell you when. I'm going to ask you to guess when. Because they showed us ebooks. They showed us GPS. It was called the You Will campaign. I want to illustrate how difficult it is to see the future, even when you can see the future.
Our card, please. Carried your medical.
Electronic medical records. In a minute, you're going to see WebEx. You'll see tablet computing. Right? All this was there. What year did AT&T run these ads? Take a guess. What year was it? We thought, by the way, at the time, this was a very distant future. Maybe our children or their children would see this. Certainly not.
Have you ever watched the movie you wanted to? The minute you wanted.
Any idea what year it was?
You will. And the company will bring it to you. AT&T.
Lawrence, take a guess. What year do you think this was? 1993. Yeah. 1993. Yeah. I was giving you a hint there. We think it's 85. We want to believe it was the 70s or the 80s. So here's what's amazing about this, and please tell me if you agree or disagree with what I'm about to say. AT&T understood the future intimately. It was able to show us exactly what life would look like today in 2020. So how is it possible to understand the future so well and yet not bring a single one of these products to market? Because AT&T did not bring these products to market. Other organizations did. So that's inconceivable to me. How can you see the future, put it on display, illustrate it so vividly, and yet not capitalize on it? And if you talk to AT&T, and over the years I've talked to many folks who were at AT&T at the time, this was after the breakup of Bell Labs. AT&T was trying to regain sort of its preeminent image of being an innovator, and they were stretching, but they understood it. They got it. But they felt these would be anecdotal technologies. They'd be technologies that would exist as a technology, but they wouldn't change behavior. And what they couldn't factor in was the enormous behavioral shift. What AT&T didn't have, because AT&T had focus groups, it had market researchers. What did AT&T not have that would ultimately have gotten them out of this conundrum that everyone in this room has today, and as a result has no excuse to be AT&T 20 years down the road? What did they not have that you have today, that every organization of scale has today? The data. The behavioral data, which is unequivocal. So when I talk to, my next book is actually on healthcare. When I talk to hospitals and providers of healthcare, what they tell me is that we are undergoing this radical shift from healthcare and clinicians and researchers which explore in hopes of serendipity, ultimately lending a hand so that they can find great discoveries, to the data being the hypothesis. The data tells me what I should look for. And now I use my intellectual capability to look in that direction. Right? I have the data to unequivocally tell me what the future, what the compass setting is pointing at in the future, and I can't ignore that. So when you say data is the new oil, you demean it. You say it's a commodity. It's the same for everyone. It is not the same for everyone, right? There are certainly industry common knowledge, but there's also organizational knowledge that is highly proprietary and allows you to serve your customer in ways that are simply impossible otherwise. And again, I talked about Kodak. I'll come back to Blockbuster a little bit later at the end of this presentation. But the streets are littered with organizations that didn't see the future. And the excuse they always have is, hey, we were stuck in the past. We had customers, we had stakeholders, stockholders, the board of directors that were all stuck in the past. And as a result, we couldn't get beyond that. We couldn't work our way out of that. Guess what? So much of the industrial era ethos is changing, and we have to change the way we look at the opportunities that we're presented with in order to understand the role that data plays in giving us a much clearer indication as to what that future is going to look like. So we could have made these excuses 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We can no longer make these excuses. The casualties from here on out are casualties that choose to ignore fundamentally the value and the insight that exists in the data that they already have, that they already own. Here's another big shift, huge shift. So computing is one of those leading indicators. The number of devices, I think, tells us in large part how we are changing behaviorally and how we will change our behaviors of a consumption-based society, consuming from an energy standpoint, a consumption-based society that will need more and more energy to be able to power all these devices. But something else is happening here. And this is one of the biggest changes, contextual changes, I think, globally. And we totally ignore it. Much to our ultimate dismay, I believe. So what you see here is a population pyramid, global population from 1950 going up through 2100. Notice the pyramid, that original shaded area, is now turning into a dome. So as I go through this time lapse, what you see is that total population, males, females, through the various age ranges, these are each 5-year age bands, is increasing dramatically. In the top of the pyramid, there's no pyramid anymore. By 2050, the pyramid goes away. By 2100, we've got less than 2 percentage points delta between the 0 through 5 age band and the 60 through 65 age band. What happens, and we know this for fact, there's research on this in abundance, what do we know about energy consumption as a population pyramid inverts in this way? The 75 through 80-year-old age band uses twice as much energy as the 0 through 5 age band. In fact, all the way up through 0 through 12, I think, that applies. Some recent numbers I saw say up through the age of 25, which is kind of interesting. I haven't looked at those as carefully. But I can point, if you want the research, I point to the research. So we're going to see a dramatic shift in consumption-based economics because of this. We're also going to see a devastating effect on social programs. The whole notion of retirement at 65, I mean, we set the retirement age at 65 in the US when the life expectancy was about 60. It was a brilliant move from an economic standpoint, right? Set the retirement age at 65, but people die when they're about 60. That's a great system. It's self-funded. It works really well. But once you invert that pyramid, that goes away. I mean, what does this do to healthcare? Right? What does this do to social welfare programs, to education? We don't know. We have no idea. And yet we ignore this. We entirely ignore this. And by the way, at 10 billion, we stop growing. The carrying capacity of the planet is about 10 billion people. So you no longer have this increasing demographic of youngsters to fund the missives of this older demographic. It goes away. Right? A radically different world than the one that we live in today in so many ways. There's a lot of contextual change, and this has direct impact, by the way, on behavior, I think. And by the way, no one's retiring. These folks they're not going to leave the workforce. People might stop working full time, but they'll work part time. They'll be consultants. If you have a device, why not be connected? Why not get some value for the value that for all this wisdom that you've accumulated over the years? So no one is leaving the pyramid from that standpoint. So you got multi-generational workforces. We have no idea what these workers of tomorrow will look like. We question it sometimes. So I will give you an image of what one of these workers look like. This is my son Adam. This is a few years back. He just turned 20, in fact. So this is when he was like 15 or so. And he still loves to game. How many of you have teenagers at home? Children in that age range? Yeah? Are they gamers? Yeah, I see a lot of long faces. Adam would have these conversations with me all the time about how important it was for his socialization that he game. How gaming wasn't about the game, it was about socializing, right? Being with his friends. And we would have these all-out arguments in many cases. So there's Adam surrounded by screens, never enough screen real estate. Just to give you sort of an analog, there's NORAD and there's Adam, okay? So let's talk about Adam's behavior for a minute. Why does Adam do this? Adam does this because socialization to him is key. And as parents, we want to be dismissive of this, right? We want to say, well, this behavior is aberrant behavior, right? He should take his face away from the device and interact more with people, right? Get a life, do something that's more productive than gaming. But to Adam, gaming is essential. It is productive. Right? This is how he makes friends. This is going back when he was a little kid. He had a room in the attic of the house where he would game, and he must have been gaming at one point for what appeared to me anyway to be 12 or 18 hours straight, without any breaks whatsoever, right? No food, no bio breaks, nothing. You're just sitting there in front of the computer. And it was a beautiful day like it is here today. And I went upstairs to talk to him, and I finally lost my patience. I said, Adam, just I'm going to shut the computer off. I'm going to turn the circuit breaker. Just go outside. Right, just go outside and get some vitamin D. The sun is shining. Play with your friends. And he said, "My friends aren't outside, Dad." I said, "There have to be some kids outside." I said, "No, they're all on this right now. We're all gaming together." And then he turned to me and he said, "I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you." He said to me, "Okay, Dad, tell me the truth. Before there were computers, what did you do to stay busy when you were young?" I thought, really? I would take my bicycle out. I'd go to the dead-end street. I'd play with my friends all day. We'd play in the woods. We'd eat nuts and berries. We'd forage, and that's what we did to survive back then. And he turns to me and he says, He says, so dead-end street, it's kind of like a cul-de-sac, right? I said, yeah, it's kind of like a cul-de-sac, exactly. He said, well, you know what, Dad? This, pointing to a screen, this is my cul-de-sac. This is where all my friends are. They're not outside where yours used to be. They're here in the game. And you stop and think, well, what do you say to your child at that point? How do you respond to that? I said, get the hell outside, get some vitamin D. That's what I said, to be honest with you. But how do you, because they're making sense, right? This is where his friends are. So for Adam, this is oxygen. This to him, and I'm not saying there aren't addictive qualities to this, there are. And as a parent, I've always continued to pull back away from the technology as far as my kids are concerned. But this is oxygen to him, right? Socialization, connectivity is essential to the human condition. It is a right that you have as a human being to have access to this. We did a study several years ago when there was still talk about the proliferation of the internet and globalization of the internet. We did a study, and granted it was only among the 2 billion people that actually use the internet, but we asked the question, what is most important to you? And we listed a number of things that would appear on Maslow's hierarchy, and one of them was internet access. Internet access always came in as one of the top 3 items, and many times it came in above food and water. Because if you have the internet, you can get anything else that you want. Right? Having the internet is essential to everything else that you need in life. This is the basis of Maslow's pyramid now. Right? The internet has become the basis of If you have that, you can get everything else. You can get healthcare, you can get sanitation, you can get that if you have this. You have a hope and a chance at getting that. So this has become in many ways an essential ingredient. And once you make it essential and you make it a right, that not all people, by the way, will embrace. We know some people won't go into this technological future willingly or joyfully, but most people that I think reasonable people will see technology as being actually an essential ingredient of what they do going forward. It's how you live your life. You can't play, you can't work, you can't live your life without it. So what does that mean to us? So let's come back to a few things that we were saying earlier. So my sense is that we are driving further and further into what I would call a frictionless future. What does it mean to be frictionless? It means that you take a lot of the administrative burden out of the process, number one, but it goes much deeper. So let's start to look at this a bit more analytically. So remember I talked earlier about what the transportation industry would look like in 2050. Let's come back to that conversation and use that as an analog here. So if we go back to Henry Ford, contemporary of Mr. Edison, and we look at what organizations looked like back then, they were clearly built around an ownership model and a product model, right? Any color you want as long as it's black, and Henry Ford wanted to own everything from the rubber tree plants all the way up to the dealerships. Complete vertical integration within one organization. Where have we gone to from there? So we've made some movement clearly. We've moved from that model to a model that we think is much more strategically focused and much more focused around service and customization of product rather than the product itself, what I was talking about earlier. And we've made some interesting detours. I'm not sure we're here yet, though. We'd like to believe that we're going in this direction, but we're not here yet. So when I think of Tesla is still very much an ownership model. Musk wants to own everything from the battery manufacturers, which he co-locates in his gigaplant. All innovation happens under one umbrella, because it's easier to control that way, understandable. If I look at Waymo, which is a much more integrated platform with a lot of suppliers, a lot of providers, a lot of technology players involved in that, it's still very much a product-based platform. It's not a service. So what does this look like? Well, let's take a look at some of the research we did, and I'll give you our sense of where we think we're going with this. So ultimately what we're driving towards is transportation as a service. Okay? And this is, again, it's one of those leading indicators that tells us how society in general is changing in its attitudes towards products and the consumption of products, and how we're moving towards more of a service-based society, and one that is asset a little less asset heavy, both individually and organizationally. So what you're looking at here, and I'm glad to provide you with the full research report for anyone that wants to dig into this. Transportation 2050 is what we call the report. At this point, it's about six months old or thereabouts. So what I'm showing you here is this is a slice of the pie. I'm showing you just within the US, let's look at consumer-driven automobiles. This is not commercial. Commercial is actually going to do this much faster than consumer will. But let's look at the consumer side of it. Today we've got about 250 million or thereabouts owned vehicles. This is the entire fleet. Used cars, leased cars, owned cars, all of that goes into this bucket. This top line shows you the increase in the total number of hours that are driven. But this orange line here is showing you the increase in total number of automobiles on the road. The dotted line is internal combustion. This dotted and dashed line is electronic vehicles. So by 2029, we crisscross. There are more EVs on the road than there are internal combustion engines. So more EVs than ICE. Predictable, right? We could have all imagined that. But something else kind of odd happens. The EVs continue to escalate, and then around 2034, we hit about 600 million total automobiles, and then we start to drop off precipitously. To the point where by 2050, we're projecting about 50 million, and that might be aggressive, versus 250 million automobiles on the road. Why? What's changed? Utilization. It's that simple. It's utilization, right? These cars that we're driving 1 or 2 hours out of the day, there is no worse use of your capital than buying an automobile. Right? It is purely for convenience, mostly for ego and convenience. We buy cars because we like that kind of car, whatever that means. The rest of the world doesn't work that way. The rest of the world wants transportation as a service. Ownership doesn't make sense to the other, 4 or 5 disenfranchised people that inhabit the planet today, and it certainly won't as we hit towards 10 billion. But what continues to increase? So as utilization, by the way, as utilization goes down, parking garages go away, parking spots go away, driveways go away, right? We free up, a good 20% of urban real estate just by doing that alone. Right? There's a whole lot that can be said for that phenomenon. But what's going on? Number of hours keep increasing. There's more people using transportation, and they're using transportation not just to be transported. This is the piece of it that most fascinates me. So when I talk to the folks that are building autonomous vehicles, they are building platforms for entertainment, for socialization, for meditative retreat, which sounds very odd, right? But if you drive in, there's a company just out of Boston, Clearview, that has built a suspension system that uses AI, and when you are in this car, you have no idea you are driving or being driven. You lose total sense of being, it's like when a plane takes off from the runway, it rumbles, and you take off, it's completely smooth. That's what it feels like. So using the car as a platform in which you can meditate, in which you can exercise, in which you can socialize and get together with your friends, have dinner. These are all absurdities today in the current model. But this is where we're moving. And cars, by the way, that will understand your biometrics and adjust to them. Right, so play music, create lighting ambiance that suits whatever your biometrics tell it at that point in time. And we're not that far from it, right? We're already seeing predictive behaviors. And AI is playing a role in that. Last night, I was I've got 20,000 photographs on my phone. Anyone have more than that? Yeah, I'm on the leading edge, and trust me, it is. I go to look for a photograph, and I can never find what I want because I've got 20,000 photographs on here. 15,000 of which are my kids. My parents had a shoebox of photographs of me growing up, right? I've got 50,000 photographs of my kids. I wanted to find a photograph of myself in Peter Drucker's home on his couch. So how the hell am I going to find that now in 20,000 photographs? Hit the home button, and try this. Siri, show me photographs in my albums of 2 people on a couch. Bingo. I got about 200 pictures back, by the way. A lot of couch pictures there. But one of them was Peter Drucker. He's not smart enough to know who Peter Drucker is, but we've got face recognition. That's just, a stone's throw away. Right? So the reason I'm saying this is because what the technology is, what the platform is, changes. Because of the application of AI, because of biometrics, because of the behavioral data, all that changes. And now I find myself in a car for all kinds of reasons I wouldn't have found myself in a car today. And when we did this study, by the way, we did it for the energy group with an IBM. This points to an enormous increase in energy consumption. It'll be electric energy consumption. How that electricity will be developed is another topic altogether, but this will certainly be electronic vehicles, not internal combustion vehicles by any stretch. Will they have solar panels on them? I just came from an event at MIT and Harvard where one of the presentations was about quantum dots, which are a whole new, anyone using quantum or researching quantum dots for solar panels yet? It's a whole new way to build solar panels. So today, if you have a solar panel, you have to have it south-facing, have it in an area where you're going to get a lot of sunlight. Quantum dots will allow you to harness the sun's light on a completely clouded over day when there's very little light that you and I can perceive. Completely different technology that will allow you to put solar panels, literally paint solar panels onto any surface. And not have to apply a panel as an external device to that vehicle or to that building or to that asset. Right? Completely counterintuitive. And again, all because this utilization curve goes up. That's the elimination of friction. Right? Today, the friction associated with transportation is that parking, it is that sitting in the drive, it is that lack of utilization of the asset. Right? These are physical assets that use physical resources to be produced. They have an ecological impact. They're not sustainable. Vehicles end up in junkyards and have all kinds of pollutants to harm the environment. This is not a sustainable future, not for 10 billion people. The only way you can create a sustainable future is through dramatic increase in utilization. Anyway, let me go through the rest of this. Fascinating. I mean, when I first saw this, the analyst that we had on staff that did this, at first I went back and said that this just can't be. I'm not buying it. If you want to see the full report, I'll get you the full report. Pretty amazing. So friction is reduced, and what does that mean? Ultimately, what it means is that we are taking out of the process that administrative overhead, that burden that stands in the way of full utilization of whatever the asset is, right? And as we eliminate friction, and Uber did this wonderfully. Uber is a great surrogate, or Lyft, or whatever you want to use, is a great surrogate for what that will look like, right? Frictionless means that you've got a better experience, a better process, and ultimately a better business. So when I look at, a few years ago when Terry Lundgren was still in charge of Macy's, we were doing some work with Macy's, and their single biggest issue is how do we get rid of the friction of the customer experience, the in-store customer experience. They haven't done a great job of it, by the way. But if you look at any business today, once I use that lens of friction, suddenly you can't ever see that business the same way again, because all you're looking for are the points where the gears grind, where they create wasted energy and wasted time. What you're seeing here is a model we built for SBLI, a large life insurer in the US, of their entire process to identify where the cofactors of friction were. So every one of these lines had a friction cofactor associated with it that would allow us to identify for any single process what's the total friction and what would it mean economically to get rid of that friction. And I think this kind of a map will become a standard way of how we look at organizations going forward. We map the organization, all of its processes, and ask the question, where is the friction, and what does it mean economically to get rid of that friction within the organization, right? Efficiency goes up, as friction goes down. It's a simple function, and I think we're all somewhat subject to it. So what does that mean to your industry specifically? And here there's a bit of an aha moment, I think, and I could be fooling myself. I might be much too naive to make that presumption. I don't. But if I think about the rate of innovation. In any industry, there are two distinct components of how we innovate. There's that ideation component, right, where model innovation happens. New business models, come out of this piece of the innovation life cycle. And this is relatively friction-free, right? An idea doesn't have a lot of friction, doesn't encounter friction. You encounter friction when you try to scale, which is what you're in. You're in the delivery of innovation business. So the question ultimately is how do you take those ideas and scale them? I remember having a conversation with Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, in 2008, we were talking about Oracle's role as an innovator, and his comment to me was a very clear and crisp one. His comment was, I don't want Oracle to be an innovator. I want to buy innovation. My role is to deliver it, not to build it. I see that as being a great analogy for what business you're in. You're in the business of delivering the innovation ultimately, but you have the data, you own that data, which these model innovators don't, right? So it's incredible partnering, but one that I think we don't see enough of in a lot of industries. We see this hard line between the model innovators and the delivery innovators, when the reality is that most of the data required to understand the innovation and how to scale it ultimately belongs to those folks that are doing the delivery. Okay, let's wrap this up. So, going forward, how do we survive and let go of the past and build a future that acknowledges a lot of these changing dynamics and the disruption that's going to come with them, as well as the opportunities that are certain to come along. So we can come back and say, what are the things driving the future? Autonomy, certainly, frictionless ecosystems, all of these will drive the future. A fair dose of AI and data in all of that, no doubt. But I want to share with you an anecdote that I think kind of makes the point and sort of brings this kind of full circle to where we began. I mentioned Peter Drucker. I had a close affiliation with Drucker for about 10 years. And one of the profound things of many that he said to me one day, as we were in his living room talking about the future of business and how the internet was going to disrupt the future of business, was this quote here. I mean, so many of us find ourselves in a position where we are doing all we can with life support to keep the past alive. So I said I'd come back to to Blockbuster at the end. So it's 2005 or thereabouts. Blockbuster had tried very hard to put Netflix out of business. It was doing everything it could to put Netflix out of business. Netflix was doing pretty damn well at the time. They had gone public. And Reed Hastings and his executive team were having an analyst call after being a public company. And one of the analysts, and by the way, unbeknownst to Reed Hastings and his executive team, John Antioco and his team were listening in on that call to find out what Netflix had to say. So at one point during the call, an analyst says to Hastings, "Hey, what are you going to do about Blockbuster? Clearly, the gorilla on the block, they can do a lot to disrupt you and to put you out of business." And Hastings' comment was, "You know what? They've thrown everything at us but the kitchen sink, and they still have not been able to shut us down." Next morning, call ends. Next morning, Hastings comes to the office, and there's a box waiting for him. And in that box was a stainless steel kitchen sink, courtesy of John and his team at Blockbuster. There's one word for this: arrogance, right? It's the arrogance that you can hold on to the past, almost like a life vest, right, to prevent your ship from sinking. Life vests don't do much at the end of the day, other than sort of preserve the remnants of a catastrophe. If that's what you want to do, then certainly this is a great role model for how to do it. The reality is that what I've shared with you, this is not opinion. I mean, I've couched it within a narrative of some opinion for sure, but the data tells us what the data tells us. And the reality is that we are in a position today where I think fundamentally we have to change our models to better acknowledge, understand, and respect the customer and approach them and deliver services to them on their own terms. And by doing that, we build loyal brands that do create the kind of bonds we want with customers to win them for life. Someone once said this: everything that can be invented has been invented. Do you want to guess who it was? Yeah, Commissioner of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, 1899. Right? At the dawn of this incredible era of innovation, right? The dawn of the light bulb and the telephone and all the things that today we take so much for granted. Your job, especially given the unique positions that you have of authority and responsibility to build the infrastructure of the future, ultimately is to understand behavior, not just technology. It is that understanding of behavior, which you cannot ignore, which you have in abundance today in the data that you already own, that I think ultimately will tell you how to build that future. Fascinating, isn't it? So much to consider. I wish we had another 2 hours. Can we do another 2 hours? Just keep going? Yeah. You're going to, but not with me, thank God. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for reminding me, Lawrence. I genuinely appreciate it. Thank you.
So obviously we don't have enough time to do the Q&A, because if we start Q&A, this room is going to just go crazy asking you questions.
But I will be here. I'll be here.
You will be here for the book signing. If you want to sign Tom's book, he's going to be here. Also, Tom is going to go for dinner.
Yes,
tonight.
I'll be there for dinner.
And so I didn't tell you, Tom. This is sort of the wild card. But at dinner, if anyone wants to ask Tom questions at dinner, he's there, right?
Oh, lovely. So you all have dinner, I don't, is what that means.
So we'll do that. But just one quick question. I'll take the prerogative as the whatever I am.
Yeah.
Why did you choose the electricity sector for your book, the first book? Why was that a good case study? Why the sector?
So what occurred to me as I began writing Bottomless Cloud was that all this innovation, AI, all this innovation we talk about over the course of the last 100 years, it happened because of that one seminal event, the electrification of industry and society. And I think what we miss in that narrative, in that story, is that it was about the product. It wasn't about the innovation that was created through electrification. And that to me is the important part of the story, is that utilities, energy through utilities and electrification allowed us to create these innovations, without which we never would have. And we're at the same point in time, I think, today, in many ways, where we see the product, we get that, but we don't see the innovation that will result from it.
Fascinating. Again, please join me in thanking Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.